Welcome to Midnight Casebook, where every shadow hides a secret and every mystery begs to be solved. Tonight, we unravel the chilling tale of They Framed Father Brown himself, a fan-made story paying homage to the brilliance of G.K. Chesterton's legendary detective. We'd love to have you along for this enigmatic journey. Drop a comment to let us know where you're watching from. Share your theories, and if you spot any inconsistencies, don't hesitate to call them out. Your keen eyes and sharp minds help us craft even more captivating mysteries in the future. Chapter 1. They blamed Father Brown first. He was still holding the knife when they found him, blood wet on the blade and the dead man's eyes staring straight at him. It was supposed to be a quiet evening, the kind that melted into the sleepy rhythm of Kembleford like dusk into dark. The fog curled low across the village, clinging to hedges and chimney smoke like secrets refusing to be lifted. Inside the vicarage, Father Brown had just extinguished the last candle after his evening prayers when the knock came, hard, furious, and repeated like a fist trying to beat back the night. He opened the door, not to a penitent soul, but to two policemen, their expressions sharp and grim, and behind them, a murder. The body was in the sacristy. A local solicitor, Mr. Howard Elcott, well-known, well-dressed, well-hated. He had been stabbed once, clean through the heart. No sign of struggle. The blood had pooled beneath the altar cloth, seeping into the red embroidered cross like an unholy sacrifice. But it wasn't the corpse that silenced the air. It was Father Brown, standing barely 5 feet away, holding the knife. He didn't speak. Not when Inspector Mallory barked questions at him. Not when Sergeant Goodfellow gently urged him to sit. He merely looked down at the blade in his hand, blinked twice, and finally whispered, "This isn't my knife." The press would go wild in the morning. Killer in a cassock. The headlines would read, "Priest or Predator." The courtroom would be hungry for blood, but the village would be worse. Whispers snaking from the bakery to the church pews, twisting into something even God wouldn't recognize. No one wanted to believe it could be true, but no one could ignore what they saw. And what they saw was damning. But even damnation has layers. Because the strange thing wasn't just that Father Brown was holding the knife. It was that his fingerprints weren't on it. None. Not a smudge. As if someone had wiped it clean, then placed it in his hand. And the real question wasn't who killed Mr. Elcott, but why they would go to such deliberate lengths to frame a man who'd spent his entire life saving souls from eternal ruin. Father Brown was released after initial questioning, though no one called it freedom. He returned to the vicarage under a black cloud, villagers crossing the street to avoid him, eyes darting behind curtains. Lady Felicia, his oldest ally, refused to believe it. She confronted Inspector Mallory in the street, her voice rising in outrage. "You think he could do something like this? You must be rotting from the inside out." Mallory didn't answer. He didn't need to. The problem was simple, too perfect. The door to the sacristy was locked from the inside. No signs of forced entry. No other footprints. The only other soul in the building was Father Brown. And the victim? Elcott had threatened to shut the church down 3 days ago over a land dispute. Motive, opportunity, means it was airtight. Uncomfortably airtight. But airtight things can suffocate the truth. The next night, something strange happened. The church bell rang, once, at midnight. No wind, no one inside. Just a sound, cold and sudden, waking half the village in terror. When Father Brown opened the door, drawn by the sound he knew no human hand could have wrung, he saw it, a single candle lit on the altar, and beside it, a glove. Not his, not the victim's, but one he recognized from a confession made weeks ago. A man had come to him in secret, whispering about sins he couldn't cleanse. Talk of deception, planted evidence, something about switching the truth with the believable. That man had vanished days before the murder. Now his glove sat in the house of God like a curse laid bare. Father Brown didn't sleep that night. Instead, he went through Elcott's files, confiscated illegally, yes, but he no longer played by rules designed by sinners. And what he found made his spine feel hollow. Elcott had blackmailed half the county. Letters, photos, threats, but there was one folder marked with a trembling red X. Inside it, a deed to a parcel of land beneath the old crypt. The signature was forged, witnessed by a man who'd been dead 5 years, and the person who would benefit from Elcott's death, not Father Brown, but someone no one dared suspect, someone with a collar of their own. The bishop, a man beloved, worshipped, a man who visited once a month and left incense in his wake, a man who would never be questioned, because if the church lost him, the diocese would crumble. It didn't make sense, and yet it made too much sense. Who else could have the authority to move undetected through sacred spaces? Who else knew the rituals, the passageways, the silence needed to kill a man in God's own sanctuary? But still, it wasn't enough. Father Brown had no proof. Only a glove. Only a ringing bell. Only silence. Until the confession came. A young acolyte, barely 20, came to him in secret, hands trembling, eyes wild. He claimed he saw someone leave the church that night, someone dressed like Father Brown, but moving differently, taller, faster, with a limp on the left leg. The boy had stayed silent because he feared for his soul, but now he feared for something more, the truth. Father Brown knew who limped. The bishop's right leg had been shattered in the war. Still, nothing could be proven. The bishop's robes were burned the next day by mistake. The acolyte disappeared, moved, they said, to a seminary in Ireland. No forwarding address. Then came the final blow. Someone broke into the vicarage. Nothing stolen, nothing broken. Just a message scrawled in ashes on the wall above his bed. Stop digging. That night, Father Brown sat in the confessional, not to absolve anyone, but to speak aloud what he could not prove. The devil's clever, he whispered into the dark. But even he leaves footprints, if you know where to look. There was no reply, only the sound of slow, deliberate breathing behind the screen. And then, the candle beside him went out. The screen slid open, but no one was there. And that is where it begins. Father Brown's eyes were no longer kind the next morning. He preached the sermon, as usual, but the words carried weight. Every line from Scripture sounded like an accusation. People squirmed. Someone left crying. And in the front pew, where the bishop used to sit, only dust now remained. The case was never closed. No one ever charged. But the whispers never stopped. Nor did the questions. The village still talks about that week. The murder no one solved. The man of God who nearly took the fall. And the question that hovers still above every mass, every prayer, every ringing bell. If Father Brown didn't do it, who did? Chapter 2. Father Brown's alibi was missing. They checked every clock in the village, and somehow time had conspired to vanish only for him. It began with silence, the kind that settles into your bones rather than your ears, the sort of silence that doesn't come from peace, but from the absence of something vital. On the second day after the murder of Howard Elcott, Father Brown awoke to find that silence pressed against the vicarage like a fog. His breakfast tray hadn't arrived. The postman hadn't whistled his usual tune, and most disturbingly, no one had come to accuse him. That silence said one thing: something worse was coming. The church had been closed since the body was found in the sacristy, and the village buzzed like hornets behind drawn curtains. Gossip, sharpened like knives, flew freely through parlors and butcher shops, but today the whispers grew louder. Inspector Mallory returned, not alone this time. A man from the Crown Office walked beside him, serious, pale, smiling like someone already sure of the outcome. They asked Father Brown one question, only one. Where were you between 8 and 9 p.m. on the night of the murder? He didn't hesitate. With Mrs. Davies, she brought me soup. I wasn't well. Except Mrs. Davies wasn't home. She had gone to the coast to visit her daughter, left the morning before the murder. Her neighbors confirmed it. The train schedule confirmed it. She hadn't returned until midday, the day after the killing, which meant the alibi Father Brown offered, an alibi he believed in with absolute certainty, was impossible. His face didn't change when they told him, his hands didn't tremble, but something in his eyes dimmed, as if he were watching something slide just beyond his grasp. That's not right, he said softly. I remember the tray. The bowl had a chip in it. I remember her voice. But when they checked the vicarage kitchen, no such bowl existed. Not chipped, not whole. It was as if the memory had been fabricated, stitched into his mind like a false prayer. The newspapers sharpened their headlines. The mad priest defense, murderer or delusional martyr. Reporters swarmed Kembleford. The streets narrowed with eyes. Some still defended him, but fewer than before. Doubt, after all, was easier to share than truth. And the worst part? Father Brown began to doubt himself. He searched through his journals, through the liturgical calendar, for some anchor, something that would prove his memory real. But the pages for that day were blank. Not torn, not smudged, just blank. A void between inked prayers. Lady Felicia, frantic, insisted she saw Mrs. Davies return late that night. Her coat was wet with rain, I swear it. But even that crumbled. The train she would have needed was cancelled. No records showed her arriving. Her daughter confirmed she slept the night away at the coast. So what did Father Brown see? Or perhaps the better question, what was he made to see? Because that's when the phone call came, not to the vicarage, but to the inn. A voice asked to speak to Inspector Mallory. The barman overheard only one thing before the line clicked dead. Check the photograph in the church office, behind the frame. Mallory did. It was a photograph of the Kembleford choir, taken a year ago at Christmas, but behind it, tucked into the wood, was a single page, torn from Father Brown's journal, the page for the night of the murder. It said only one thing. He'll arrive after Vespers. I must be ready. A trap? A warning? A confession? The writing matched Father Brown's exactly. He was taken into custody that night, not formally charged, but questioned again, this time under brighter lights and colder voices. He didn't resist, only murmured once, "That page wasn't missing yesterday." Back at the vicarage, Sid Carter, ever loyal, ever suspicious, began his own investigation. He found something strange. The fireplace hadn't been lit in 3 days, yet there was fresh ash in the grate. Beneath it, a partially burned handkerchief, monogrammed, with the bishop's initials. Again, and yet again, there was no proof, no trace of the bishop's presence. He had, as always, a perfect schedule, an alibi for every hour, except one, the same hour Father Brown now lacked. The mystery deepened, not with answers, but with fractures, each revelation breaking the ground beneath their feet. Mrs. McCarthy insisted she remembered Father Brown coughing during that hour from the rectory kitchen. But when pressed, she admitted she couldn't recall if it was that night or the one before. And then came the nightmare. A child, barefoot, wandering through the nave. No one knew her. She said nothing, just walked to the front, pointed to the altar, and said, "He told me to forget." Then collapsed. When she awoke, she didn't remember being there or speaking. No one had brought her. No one claimed her. It was as though she'd been dropped into the church by something not quite human. And when the choir robes were checked, one was missing, the smallest one. Child-sized. They checked the church logs. The side door, long sealed, had been opened at precisely 8:12 p.m. on the night of the murder, closed again at 8:59, and the only key that could unlock that door belonged to Father Brown, except his copy was accounted for, hanging in its place, untouched. But the lock showed no signs of tampering. So how had it been opened? The village priest had an alibi that didn't exist, and a key that didn't move, yet someone used both to commit a murder and leave a trail that never quite vanished, but never quite held together either. And then the first big reveal. A letter arrived. No return address. The handwriting barely legible, as if written in haste or terror. It read, "The man you saw was not alone. He never is. Don't trust your own eyes. You're being made to forget, just like me, just like her." Attached was a photo, grainy, of the church, taken from the outside at night, and in the window, a figure, wearing a cassock, but not Father Brown's. The sleeves were too long, the hands, wrong, one bent at an angle not found in any natural body. The face, if you could call it that, blurred beyond recognition. But the worst part was that, in the figure's hand, was the same chipped bowl Father Brown swore he remembered. And suddenly, the impossible question became unbearable. If Father Brown hadn't imagined the soup, who put it there, and why? He stopped sleeping, kept the lights on all night, spoke less in sermons. When asked about the case, he would only say, "The mind plays tricks, especially when someone else is playing first." Then came the final blow. Mrs. Davies returned, pale, visibly shaken. She claimed she had been in the vicarage that night, but someone had come to her room while she was packing, whispered into her ear, and the next thing she remembered was waking up in her daughter's guest room with no luggage and a nosebleed she couldn't explain. No one believed her, but Father Brown did. He touched her hand gently and whispered, "They've used you, as they've used me." And that was when he knew. But he didn't tell anyone. Instead, at Mass the following Sunday, Father Brown stood before his dwindling congregation, gazed steady, and said, "Sometimes the devil doesn't come as a beast. Sometimes he comes as memory." Then he smiled, not kindly, not warmly, but knowingly, because there are some things even faith cannot untangle. And as he stepped down from the pulpit, someone in the back pew, someone with a limp, stood, turned, and walked out through the side door, without a sound. And Father Brown never mentioned the missing alibi again. Chapter 3. Who really framed Father Brown? The letter that proved Father Brown's innocence was written in his own handwriting and dated 3 days after he'd supposedly already confessed to the murder. It arrived by post at dawn, slipped under the vicarage door in an envelope sealed with wax bearing the bishop's crest. Father Brown didn't open it immediately. He sat staring at it, cup of cold tea trembling in his hands, as though it was something alive. The envelope felt heavier than it should have been, and something in the wax seal looked slightly off, as if it had been pressed by someone unfamiliar with its use, someone who copied the impression but not the authority. Inside was a letter, a short one, no more than 3 sentences. I have seen the truth, but I cannot speak it. Not yet. If anything happens to me, know this. The man you trust most will be the one who damns you. Do not look to the shadows. Look to the mirror. It was signed with his own name. Ink. In his exact handwriting, dated 3 days after the murder of Howard Elcott, the very murder for which Father Brown had been quietly tried by the court of public opinion and convicted in the pews of Kembleford. The village had not spoken the words aloud, but they had already mourned him, already removed him from their thoughts. The gentle priest, who once knew every child's birthday and every widow's sorrow, had been turned into a thing whispered about, nodded at from afar. A living ghost. But this letter, this impossible letter, reignited the storm. Inspector Mallory returned, furious and deeply unsettled. He examined the ink, the seal, the paper, all authentic. But the date was wrong, or worse, right, and the facts they'd accepted for a week were about to unravel like a noose that had been tied too early. Father Brown, as usual, gave no protest, only a single phrase murmured like a prayer. If the devil wrote it, he's learned to wear my skin. Mystery, once thought solved, now gaped open again like a wound. Who had forged the priest's hand with such skill? And more terrifying, why write a letter that exonerates him when the frame had been so flawlessly constructed? This wasn't mercy, it was a message. The investigation, reluctantly reopened, began to turn inward, not toward the crime itself, but toward those around it. The bishop, who had once been mentioned and then buried in silence, re-emerged as a figure of unease. His presence had always unsettled Father Brown, not for what he did, but for what he refused to do. Look deeply. The bishop always moved like a man, with too many secrets in too few pockets. Then came the whisper, a single piece of parish gossip, muttered by a dying man in the infirmary, half lost in morphine and memory. I saw the cassock, but it didn't touch the floor. No one knew what he meant, no one except Father Brown. He remembered the footsteps that night, soft, deliberate, but wrong, hollow, and the robe he saw in his peripheral vision as he bent to pray. The hem floated, only an inch, but enough to know that the thing that walked past him was dressed in his clothes, moved like a priest, but was not one. He went back to the church alone that night, lit a single candle, and stood in the confessional, not to confess, but to listen, and after 10 minutes of silence, he heard it. The breath, not his, not God's, something else. Closer than the other side of the screen, it spoke only one word. Why? He did not answer. The candle extinguished itself. The air turned colder. And Father Brown smiled. Because truth cannot be murdered, only buried. The next day, someone else was missing. The church accountant, Mr. Hill, failed to arrive for his duties. His home, tidy as always, bore no sign of struggle. Except one thing. His Bible was missing, and in its place was a sheet of parchment. Another letter, again, in Father Brown's handwriting. This one read, "The lamb who counts the coins will lie for the shepherd." Hill was later found wandering the train tracks 6 miles from the village, barefoot, incoherent, muttering about fire behind stained glass. He would never recover. His ledgers, once pristine, now told a different story. Dozens of irregular transactions, small sums hidden beneath layers of donation records, and each payment traced back to Howard Elcott. Blackmail, bribes, or something darker. The first big reveal came not from a document, but from a child's drawing. At the Sunday school, one of the children, a quiet girl named Lillian, handed Father Brown a picture she'd drawn. "It's you," she said, "but not." The drawing showed a priest, tall, faceless, standing over a body in the church. But the priest had no hands, just shadows where fingers should be. When asked what she meant, the girl said, "He's the one who told me to leave the candle on." "What candle, dear?" Father Brown asked. "The one under the man's head." There had been a candle found burned out beneath Elcott's body. It had never been mentioned in public, never printed in the papers. How did she know? The girl's parents couldn't explain. She'd woken screaming the night of the murder, claiming she saw the priest in the hallway. But her house was 2 streets away from the church. Locked. No one else saw anything. And still, the girl insisted. "He looked like you, Father, but wrong." That word again. Wrong. Father Brown began to wonder, what if this was not just a crime of man, but something deeper, a manipulation of perception, a poisoning of memory, a deception not meant to win, but to destroy? Whoever framed him hadn't simply planted evidence. They'd taken control of the story, bent timelines, stolen alibis, implanted false memories. The truth was no longer about facts. It was about who controlled the narrative. And whoever they were, they wanted to write Father Brown out of it completely. One final clue surfaced. Sid Carter, investigating old archives, discovered something buried in the diocesan records. 20 years ago, a similar case had occurred in another village. A respected priest, accused of murder. All evidence pointed to him. His alibi vanished. Witnesses recanted. He was defrocked, disgraced, and disappeared. The case was sealed by the bishop himself. Father Brown read the file and found a photograph. The priest in it looked eerily like himself, too much like himself. Same height, same eyes, even the same mole beneath the ear. But it wasn't him. Or was it? He began to question things no priest should question. The nature of memory, the shape of evil, whether history was repeating or whether he was caught in a pattern older than the church itself. Because maybe this wasn't the first time he had been framed. Maybe it wouldn't be the last. At the next sermon, Father Brown paused mid-homily, looked out at the congregation, and said quietly, "The devil doesn't need to tempt us when he can impersonate us." Then he stepped down from the pulpit and walked directly to the back of the church, where a man had been sitting every Sunday for 3 weeks. A man no one remembered arriving. A man who never looked up from his hymnal. Father Brown reached out to him. The man looked up and had his face. Exactly. Father Brown said only one word. "Why?" The man smiled. then vanished, not fled, not ran, vanished, gone, the pew empty, the hymnal cold, and when they searched the records, no one knew who he was. No one had seen him arrive. No one had spoken to him. He had never existed. Or perhaps he always had. Father Brown never explained what he saw, only that the truth was deeper than any trial could uncover, and that whoever really framed him did it so well even God might be fooled. Chapter 4. The Evidence. Father Brown feared. The photograph showed Father Brown standing over the victim's body, holding a bloody candlestick, except the photograph had been taken before the murder even occurred. No one knew where the image came from. It was slipped anonymously into Inspector Mallory's case file overnight, tucked between pages of crime scene notes like a worm burrowed into fruit. The edges were curled, the ink faint, but the figures were clear. The chapel's stone floor, the dead man's robes sprawled at an unnatural angle, and Father Brown, his face turned to the camera as if he knew the moment was being captured. Mallory's hands shook when he found it. The timestamp, written in red ink on the back, matched the night of the murder, but was marked 20 minutes before the church doors were unlocked, before anyone had entered, before the lights had been turned on. The inspector didn't show it to Father Brown right away. He couldn't. There was something deeply wrong with the photo. Not just the implications of what it showed, but what it didn't. There was no shadow beneath Father Brown's feet, no reflection in the polished floor, as if the figure was present and not present, real but removed. The camera had captured something the human eye couldn't, and the mind refused to comprehend. When Mallory finally showed it to him, Father Brown didn't speak. He didn't blink. He merely traced the edges with one finger, lips parted in breathless disbelief. Then he whispered, "It's not the photo that frightens me. It's the memory." The inspector stared at him. "You remember that moment?" "I remember being watched," Father Brown said quietly, "but I was alone." The case, already suffocating under suspicion and half-believed truths, now twisted into something else, something darker. Someone had orchestrated this image, and worse, timed it to coincide with a scene that hadn't yet happened. Was it premonition, manipulation, or some cruel artifice designed to break the last resolve Father Brown held? But the priest wouldn't fold. He began asking questions the police had long stopped asking. Who had keys to the chapel beyond himself? What members of the choir had fallen ill or disappeared? What altar boys had quietly been replaced in the last month without ceremony or notice? And slowly, something emerged. A pattern. Every Sunday for the past 6 months, the same 4 people had shown up early to clean the sanctuary, but no one remembered inviting them. Their names were never recorded. They came and went without notice, and now 3 of them were gone, left town, no forwarding address, no parish records, as if they'd never existed. Only one remained, a man named Reese, young, quiet, gentle in manner, but never known to speak more than a few sentences. When questioned, he claimed to be from Ireland, but no trace of him could be found in the diocese archives, not even a birth certificate. Father Brown, pressing gently, asked about the photograph. Reese said nothing, but his hands trembled, and then he made a strange request. "Will you hear my confession, Father?" They sat in the chapel, dimly lit by flickering votives. Reese knelt, and what he whispered behind the screen made Father Brown's heart freeze in his chest. "I didn't frame you," he said. "I just set the stage." Father Brown didn't speak. He barely breathed. They paid. Me, I don't know who, I don't even remember their face. Only the eyes, grey, cold, said they were correcting history, said it already happened. What already happened? Father Brown asked, his voice almost inaudible. The murder, Reese whispered. Yours. The next morning, Reese vanished, left everything behind, his robes, his shoes, even his wallet. Only one thing remained, the photo, torn into 6 perfect pieces, arranged like a puzzle on the altar. Except now, there was a 7th piece, a figure standing behind Father Brown, not visible in the original, a face like smoke, robes stitched from a shadow, no eyes, no mouth, just a shape. And now the fear took root, because Father Brown remembered something he had never said aloud. The week before the murder, he had a dream where he stood in the sacristy, holding a candlestick, and a voice behind him said, "This is how they'll see you." He had dismissed it as stress, as guilt, as nothing. But it wasn't nothing. It was preparation. The first big reveal came not from evidence, but from memory. Sid Carter, digging through Father Brown's belongings in search of any overlooked clue, found a box beneath the floorboards. Inside, old photographs, many of them religious gatherings. But one stood out, an old retreat in Sussex, dated 1987, a dozen priests. One of them, Father Brown. And standing directly behind him, again, was the faceless figure, this time not blurred, not imagined, just there. Everyone else smiling, that figure still as a tombstone. No one seemed to notice it, no one asked why. Father Brown stared at the photo for hours, then said, "He's been following me longer than I thought." The villagers began to whisper about curses, about sacred spaces turned foul. A woman claimed the bell tower rang at midnight with no one inside. A child screamed during Mass, pointing at the pulpit and shouting, "He's not wearing his face," even though Father Brown stood right in front of her, entirely calm. And yet the fear was no longer just external. It lived inside him now. The evidence, it seemed, had never been planted to convict him in court, but to dismantle him from within. It was personal, psychological, surgical. They weren't trying to kill Father Brown. They were trying to unmake him. He no longer trusted his own hands. He began checking his pockets before and after every service, cataloguing what he touched, writing timestamps of where he stood. Because who could say what would be found next? A second bloody knife? A forged journal? A recording? Then came the final twist. The bishop returned, unannounced. He walked into the vicarage like a man arriving for tea, coat dry, despite the rain, smiling in that familiar way, thin, formal, and cold. "I've come to clear your name," he said. Father Brown didn't answer. The bishop poured tea, speaking, calmly, as if nothing had happened. As if the last 3 weeks of horror and doubt had simply been a fever dream. "I've spoken with Mallory. The photo, the letters, it was a rogue element, a zealot with delusions of grandeur. They've been handled." Father Brown watched him carefully. "Then why do you seem relieved, not horrified?" The bishop didn't blink. "Because we nearly lost you, Father. And it would have been such a loss." There was something final in his tone, something rehearsed. And as he left, Father Brown noticed the teacup, empty, but still steaming, and beneath it, an impression in the doily, a single wax seal, pressed faintly, the bishop's crest, but reversed, as if mirrored, as if someone had copied it, and suddenly, Father Brown understood. Whoever orchestrated this had not only framed him, they had become him, step by step, word by word, act by act, so closely, so perfectly, that perhaps even he no longer knew who he was. When asked later what he believed the truth was, Father Brown gave no certainty. He simply said, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." And then, with trembling hands, he tore the photo into 7 pieces once again. But this time, he burned them, one by one by one. Chapter 5. His fingerprints were on murder. The murder weapon had Father Brown's fingerprints in perfect condition, except Father Brown had never touched it, and the victim hadn't even been killed with it. When the police retrieved the ceremonial dagger from beneath the chapel's altar cloth, it was wrapped in white linen, like something sacred. But once unwrapped, it revealed a thin sheen of dried blood across the blade, and along the hilt, 5 unmistakable prints. Clear, clean, pressed in a way only intentional contact could create. Inspector Mallory stared at the results for nearly an hour in silence. It was impossible. Father Brown had sworn, under oath and in private confession, that he had never seen the blade before in his life. And yet here was irrefutable, physical evidence. The lab confirmed it with scientific confidence. The fingerprints weren't just a match. They were unblemished, untouched by smudge or struggle, as if someone had placed them there like a signature. But that wasn't the worst of it. The pathologist's report arrived shortly after. The victim, Howard Elcott, had not been stabbed with a dagger. He had been strangled. No wounds matched the blade. No trace of metal had entered the body. The blood wasn't his. And even stranger, it wasn't human. That single contradiction cracked open everything. Father Brown was called back in, this time not with a tone of inquiry, but accusation. Mallory placed the weapon on the table and said only, "Explain this." Father Brown leaned forward slowly, looked down at the weapon, then closed his eyes. "You want the explanation I can give," he said softly, "or the one you'll believe?" From that moment, the mystery unraveled like thread soaked in oil, fast, hot, and uncontrollable. Father Brown insisted he'd never laid eyes on the dagger, but he had seen one like it once, in a story told to him by a dying missionary, a relic from a forgotten order, used, not in defense, but in ritual, a blade never meant to kill bodies, but to cut sin out of the soul. He had laughed at it then, but now the laugh caught in his throat, like ash. Sid Carter, ever unwilling to leave riddles unsolved, began tracing the dagger's origins. It wasn't from the church's collection, not listed in inventory, not part of any ceremonial set, no records of its existence, but a symbol engraved along the hilt, a twisted cross, intersected by a circle, matched a long-defunct group called the Order of the Reclaimed Veil, rumored to be excommunicated centuries ago for heresy. They believed some sins could not be forgiven, only physically removed. That order had supposedly vanished in the early 1800s. But someone had the blade now, and somehow Father Brown's fingerprints were on it. He began doubting his own memories. He began dreaming things he hadn't lived, seeing images that didn't belong to him. A blackened chapel, a chanting voice, a man kneeling in front of him whispering, "Strike now, Father. End the stain." He'd wake drenched in sweat, hands shaking, heart pounding like guilt in the dark. But worst of all was what he found under his bed. wrapped in brown paper. No name, no note, just a photograph. The victim, Elcott, alive, smiling, and beside him, Father Brown. Except Father Brown had no memory of that day, no recollection of the suit he wore, the garden behind them, the flowers blooming out of season. But the image was real, dated, and someone had written on the back, in Father Brown's handwriting, "This is where it began." Now the question was no longer was he framed, but was he being made to forget what he had done? The psychological tension fractured deeper. Father Brown withdrew from the parish, refused to preach, locked himself in the vicarage for days, writing, then burning what he wrote. Mrs. McCarthy said she heard him speak aloud, in the middle of the night, arguing with himself, or perhaps with someone else. And sometimes his voice would stop mid-sentence, as if he were being cut off by something only he could hear. The first big reveal arrived not from the investigation, but from a memory triggered by scent. Lavender. Father Brown smelled it as he passed the crypt. Sweet, strong, too out of place for a place of death. It reminded him of something, a funeral. Years ago, a woman named Beatrice Lyle. Her body had never been found, only a note that read, "He is not who you think." She had disappeared after accusing a priest, never publicly named, of manipulating her into self-exile. Father Brown had dismissed it as madness then, but now he remembered her voice. Soft, uncertain, desperate. The same voice that had echoed in his dreams recently, whispering things he couldn't understand. He returned to the crypt that night, alone. And under the loose stone, by the eastern wall, he found it. A glove, silk, monogrammed, and inside the folded fingers, a fragment of a clerical collar, stained with dried blood, not new, decades old, and on the inside edge, the faint trace of a fingerprint, an exact match to Father Brown. He took it straight to Sid. They had it examined, and the technician confirmed what was now becoming unbearable. Father Brown's prints were appearing on things he had never touched, objects he had no access to, evidence from years before. How? Why? Unless someone had not just framed him now, but had been laying the groundwork for years. Who could do that? Only someone with access, influence, patience, and only one person fit, the bishop. Again, every thread led back to him. And yet, nothing could be proven. His records were clean, his movements precise, his letters sealed in perfect protocol. But there were gaps, 10-minute absences, oddly timed sermons, a peculiar reluctance to speak of his time before rising to bishopric. And then came the final twist. The bishop invited Father Brown to tea. They spoke cordially, pleasantly, the way old friends do before something irrevocable breaks between them. At the end of the conversation, the bishop placed something on the table, a candlestick, identical to the one from the murder scene. He smiled. "I thought you might want to bless it. It's found its way back to the church." Father Brown stared. "Where did you find it?" The bishop's smile never wavered. "In your hands," he said. Later that night, Father Brown was found sitting alone in the chapel, not praying, not writing, just staring. When Sid approached, Father Brown whispered, "I think he's been doing it for years. Not to me, through me." Sid asked, "What does that mean?" Father Brown turned his head slowly, eyes hollow. "What if the fingerprints are real? Because the hands were mine, but the will wasn't." The chapel fell silent, and then Father Brown said the one thing no one wanted to hear. I'm not sure if I'm me anymore. The case remains unsolved. The dagger vanished again, and Father Brown never touched a chalice without gloves from that day forward. Chapter 6. Father Brown enters the confessional. The man who confessed to murder wasn't alive when the murder happened, and he had been buried by Father Brown himself. It began on a Thursday, late in the evening, just as the shadows of the nave stretched long and thin across the chapel floor. Rain tapped gently on the stained glass, and thunder whispered at the edge of the village like a secret too afraid to be spoken aloud. Father Brown, worn from sleepless nights and drowning in the weight of unanswered questions, entered the confessional with no expectation but silence. He'd come not for others, but for himself, for stillness, for solitude. But what greeted him wasn't stillness. It was breathing, steady, slow, measured. Not the trembling breath of a penitent, but the deliberate kind, the kind taken by someone rehearsing their words before unleashing them like a dagger. Father Brown didn't speak first. The rules were simple. He waited, and then the voice came. I killed Howard Elcott. It was flat, emotionless, like reading the news aloud. But it wasn't the admission that made Father Brown flinch. It was the voice itself, because it belonged to a man named Thomas Gray, a man Father Brown had buried 13 years ago. He leaned forward, heart stalling. What did you say? I killed him, the voice repeated, calm, deliberate. I slit his throat, but I made it look like strangulation. The blade was for distraction. The fingerprints were for you. Father Brown's blood ran cold. Who are you? He asked, a soft laugh. You already know. You just won't let yourself remember. And then the screen slid closed, fast and sudden. Father Brown pushed open the door and rushed out, but the other side of the confessional was empty. No footsteps, no departing coat, just the lingering scent of ash and incense. He scanned the chapel, empty pews, flickering candles, nothing but ghosts. He didn't sleep. That night, he sat at his desk, staring at the burial record. Thomas Gray died 13 years ago. Car accident, closed casket, buried beneath the old yew tree. Funeral performed by Father Brown himself. He remembered the mother sobbing. The rain. The wooden crucifix slipped into the coffin before sealing. But something about that memory was off. It was too clean, too symmetrical. The next morning, he exhumed the grave. With permission? No, but desperation had replaced procedure long ago. The coffin was there, undisturbed. But when opened, the truth stared back at him like a void. It was empty, no remains, just the crucifix, polished and dry, lying alone in the center. There had been no body. Thomas Gray hadn't died. He had disappeared, which meant someone had orchestrated the entire thing, his death, his burial, the record, the funeral, every detail manufactured and planted for one purpose, to come back now. But why? The deeper Father Brown dug, the more the dirt refused to settle. Thomas Gray had been one of the altar boys 2 decades earlier, quiet, intelligent, devoted. But he had vanished one winter night after a dispute with Elcott, one no one had dared speak of. The whispers had always been vague, a missing ledger, accusations of blackmail, and then a car crash. End of story. Or so it seemed. Now the confession had reopened a wound that had never properly bled. Father Brown searched the church records again, deeper this time, past the baptismals and marriage logs. Hidden in a file, not accessed in 15 years, he found a note, unsigned, undated, slipped between 2 pages of a hymnal index. The body lies not in earth, but in memory. The truth is written backwards. It made no sense, until he realized the handwriting matched his own. He stared at it for hours, trying to remember when he could have written it, but nothing came. Nothing made sense. And then something strange happened. He held the paper up to the mirror, and the ink changed. Not visibly, not literally, but perceptually, the words rearranged in his mind. The murderer lies in the one who remembers. The confession is the mirror. It made his stomach turn. Was this a warning, a riddle, or a suggestion? And then, another twist. Sid Carter uncovered something that had been missed in the original investigation. The security log at the back of the rectory, long dismissed because the church had no cameras, did record something else: door openings, pressure sensors, weight signatures. At 8:47 p.m., on the night of Elcott's murder, the door to the confessional opened twice, once from the outside and once from within. But no one had entered through the front, and the pressure signature from within registered as 0, no weight, no physical presence. But the latch opened anyway. Father Brown sat in that same confessional the following night, waiting, and at precisely the same time, 8:47, the screen opened. No sound, no breath, just a voice. "You know me now, don't you?" Father Brown didn't respond. "You know why I returned." Still silence. The voice softened. "You knew the first time. You just didn't want to know." And then the question. The voice asked, "Do you remember what you confessed?" The room turned to ice. Father Brown's mind spun, because that was the part no one knew. He had confessed all those years ago. To what? He never told. Not the bishop, not Sid, not even God aloud. It had been a moment of weakness, a moment of fear, and now it was being used against him, because someone had heard it, someone who shouldn't have, someone who wasn't alive. The following day, a new letter arrived at the church. No stamp, no handwriting, just an old black and white photograph. A boy, Father Brown as a child, standing outside a burnt building, and on the back, a single line. "You lit the fire. You prayed it would rain." He dropped it. For the first time in all this, he dropped something out of sheer fear. He couldn't deny it anymore. Whoever was doing this didn't just know the facts. They knew the truths, the buried ones, the ones Father Brown himself had forgotten, or suppressed, or twisted into softer versions. This wasn't just a mystery anymore. This was judgment. And perhaps the worst part was, he didn't know if he was innocent. He sat alone that night, candlelit shadows dancing along the vicarage walls, whispering prayers, half-finished. He tried to remember Thomas Gray's face, but all he saw was his own. Time looped in his mind. Did he bury the wrong person? Or did he bury the right one, and lie to himself about it? When he returned to the confessional the next night, he didn't sit to hear a confession. He gave one. "I think I was part of it. Not the act, but the silence. The forgetting. The lie told so many times I believed it." The silence didn't answer. Then the voice. "Then you know what happens next." The candle beside him extinguished. The air thickened, and from the other side of the screen came one final whisper. "Forgive me, Father, for you have sinned." And then nothing. No exit. No movement. The other side empty, but the confessional smelled of fire. The chapel, locked from the inside, and when Sid arrived 20 minutes later, he found Father Brown still seated, face pale, eyes wide open, staring forward as if he'd seen something human minds weren't meant to hold. Sid asked what happened. Father Brown whispered, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." And behind him, the crucifix cracked down the center. Chapter 7. The Witness Who Vanished Overnight. She screamed in open court that she saw Father Brown kill the man. And by morning, both she and the entire transcript of her testimony had disappeared as if she never existed. Her name was Clarissa Hume, 29, local school teacher, meticulous in dress and painfully precise in language. She had never been involved in any legal matter in her life, never missed a Sunday mass, never uttered a word of gossip louder than a whisper. And yet, on the third day of the inquest, when witnesses were called to establish Father Brown's whereabouts the night of the murder, she stood up, uncalled, pale as chalk, and declared, "He did it. I saw him. He looked me in the eye as he dragged the body through the aisle." The court erupted. The judge ordered silence. Inspector Mallory sat stunned, pen frozen mid-note. Father Brown turned slowly, no panic in his eyes, only something more dangerous. Recognition? Clarissa trembled as she spoke, but her voice held. She said she'd been in the chapel, after hours, hiding, that she'd heard voices, strange voices, chanting, not in Latin, but something older, that she saw a cloaked figure lift a body, drag it from the altar, and that when the candlelight touched his face, it was Father Brown. Then she fainted. They carried her out. A doctor was called. She was taken to the rectory to rest. She never arrived. By morning, she was gone. Not missing. Erased. There was no sign of her at the rectory. No doctor had been summoned. Her name was struck from the witness list. Her sworn statement vanished from the official court notes. The clerk claimed he'd never heard of her. The bailiff said she never entered. But half the room remembered her. The other half? Nothing. A split memory, like reality had been edited mid-sentence. Father Brown said nothing the entire day. Not in court, not in the vicarage, not even to Sid. That night, he stood before the crucifix alone and whispered one line, barely audible. "They're removing the truth, one person at a time." The next morning, Sid Carter went to Clarissa's house. He knocked. No answer. The windows were dark. He forced the back door open, found the house completely intact. Dishes in the sink, teacup half full, ironing board still warm. But no sign of Clarissa. No clothing missing. Her wallet untouched. The only thing that seemed changed was the portrait above her fireplace. It now showed a woman Father Brown didn't recognize. The nameplate beneath it read, Clara Hume, 1882 to 1910. It wasn't a photograph, it was a painting that had not been there 2 days before. He reached out to touch it. The paint was fresh. The frame was engraved on the back with a phrase, "She was heard. She won't be again." Sid brought the painting to Father Brown. He stared at it in silence for over an hour. Then he turned and said, "This is what they're doing now. They're rewriting people into the past. They're smoothing the fabric of the lie." The madness didn't stop there. A student at the school, 12-year-old Samuel Green, claimed Miss Hume had given him homework the day before she disappeared. He even showed the page, her handwriting unmistakable. But when Sid returned with it to confirm the evidence, it was blank. Not erased, never written. And Samuel, he didn't remember showing it to anyone. And then he vanished. Too, not from the village, from memory. His desk was still at the school. His name was carved into it, but none of the children knew who he was, not even the teacher. Father Brown was losing the case. But worse, he was losing the world around the case. People weren't dying. They were being unwritten. And whoever was orchestrating it wasn't just clever. They were omnipotent. Or close enough. Then came the first big reveal. Sid broke into the courthouse after hours, hoping to recover the original court recordings. If Clarissa's voice was recorded, maybe, just maybe, the truth could be pulled back from the edge. He found the tape. He played it, and heard exactly one sentence. Not from Clarissa, from himself. A whisper, caught accidentally by the court microphone. Sid's own voice, saying, "They told me she had to go." "I'm sorry, Father." Sid didn't remember saying that. He swore he didn't, but there it was. And Father Brown, upon hearing it, didn't blink. He simply asked, "What else have they made you forget?" Sid said nothing, because something cold had just climbed his spine. And now, the question no one dared speak aloud sat heavy in the air. What if this wasn't about proving Father Brown's innocence? What if this was about proving memory itself couldn't be trusted? Clarissa had been the last thread tying the real narrative together. She had remembered something no one else was allowed to. She saw what others didn't or weren't permitted to. She became dangerous. And then she became fiction. That night, Father Brown returned to the chapel and sat in the pews until dawn. Not praying, not thinking, just waiting. At 3:03 a.m., the confessional door creaked open. No one stepped out, but a piece of paper slid across the marble floor. He picked it up. A single line was typed across the center. "Do not look for the ones we've removed. You'll only lose more." He turned toward the confessional, empty. The smell of burnt wax lingered, and the flame on the altar behind him flickered. Backward. That was the moment Father Brown finally whispered, "I think they've moved from murder to reality itself." The next Mass was held under heavy cloud. The village was quiet, and when he looked at the front row of pews, where the Hume family always sat, he saw something that broke him. 3 people sat there, 2 parents, 1 daughter, but it wasn't Clarissa. It was a girl he'd never seen. And on the hymnal in front of her, she had scribbled a note to herself. Just one sentence. "Don't let them know I remember." He looked up. She met his eyes and smiled. Not kindly, but like someone who knew too much and knew she'd be next. When Father Brown was asked later by the bishop what happened to the missing witness, he said only one thing: "I know who erased her, but the truth will never be told." Chapter 8. Father Brown's name was whispered. The dead man's final breath wasn't a scream, a gasp, or a prayer. It was a whisper, and it was Father Brown's name. It shouldn't have been possible. There were no witnesses in the chapel when Howard Elcott collapsed. No one living, at least. The coroner's report claimed his windpipe was crushed, and yet the officer who found the body swore that as he leaned in, thinking he might still be alive, the man's lips moved. Just once. The sound, barely audible, a breath, not a word, but the syllables unmistakable. Brown, not a plea for help, not a confession, just a name, coated in blood and horror. Father Brown had heard his name spoken in countless ways, cried out in absolution, murmured in grief, shouted in outrage. But never like this, never from lips already half dead, already beyond breath. That whisper didn't just stain his name, it infected it. It was repeated, reshaped, retold through every hallway in the village. The butcher said it was the sound of guilt. The librarian said it was a hex. The children in schoolyard chants turned it into a curse. By week's end, his name alone sent a shiver down spines. What haunted Father Brown more than the whisper was what followed. 3 nights later, the church's old phonograph, silent for decades, played by itself. One note, then another, and then a voice, his own, reciting a funeral prayer, but not for Elcott, for himself. Father Brown didn't remember recording it, but the voice was his, clear, measured. And at the end of the prayer, the whisper came again, low, drawn out. Brown. He pulled the needle from the player, threw the record into the fire. But the next morning, it was back on the turntable, unburned, untouched, waiting. Inspector Mallory was losing patience. Not with the evidence, it all still pointed too neatly to Father Brown, but with the impossibility of it. Witnesses who vanished, objects that reappeared, words that crawled from the mouth of a corpse. And now this. The whisper had turned contagious. Sid Carter, while reviewing old interview tapes, heard it faintly in the background, always at the same timestamp. 3 minutes, 33 seconds in, no matter which tape, no matter the case. A whisper of Brown, as if it had been imprinted onto everything, like a watermark of guilt. And that's when Father Brown began to wonder, what if this wasn't a name anymore? What if it was a sentence? He delved into old parish records, deaths, suicides, murders. He found something peculiar. Every 10 years, almost precisely, a man of the cloth was accused of something he didn't commit. Each case different, the names changing, but always the victim's last word was the same. Brown, a priest in Yorkshire in 1894, another in Manchester in 1904, one in Essex in 1915. The pattern continued, each name filed, buried, forgotten, but not erased, and in every case the priest went mad, or vanished, or died under circumstances too tragic to question. Father Brown stared at their portraits. None looked like him, and yet, somehow, they all did. The church refused to acknowledge the pattern. Coincidence, they said. Folklore, rural hysteria. But folklore didn't whisper your name from a dead man's throat. Folklore didn't burn itself into vinyl. Folklore didn't creep into every quiet moment, like rot. He returned to the confessional, thinking the silence might offer clarity. It didn't. Instead, the whisper returned. Not from outside, from behind his wall. The voice was not the same as before. It was older now, sadder. And it spoke a question. Do you remember who wore your name before you? Father Brown closed his eyes and remembered something he shouldn't have been able to. A dream. Or was it a memory? He was standing in the chapel. Not this one, another, older, dustier, stone darker. Candles flickering like breath on glass. And there, kneeling in the pews, was a man, dressed in his robes, head bowed. And when the man looked up, he had no face, only skin, stretched smooth and blank. But his lips moved, one word. Brown. He woke shaking. And in the mirror across from his bed, for a fraction of a second, he saw not his own face, but the faceless man from the dream. Sid tried to convince him it was stress, hallucinations, but Sid had heard the whisper too. And the night he tried to record it, his equipment melted, not burned, melted, cassette reels drooped, like wax in heat. Plastic warped. The walls in his room had the faint scent of ozone, like lightning had passed through and paused only long enough to listen. The first big reveal came when Father Brown returned to the archives. Not church records this time. Birth certificates. He searched the name. Brown. Thousands, of course. But among them, one stood out. A boy born in 1855. Name, Elijah Brown. Orphaned. No known family. Raised by the diocese. Became a priest at 27. Assigned to a remote parish in Scotland. Died in 1894. Suicide by hanging. But the church had recorded his last words. One line. Forgive me for what I'll become. Father Brown stared at the entry for a long time, then turned the page. Another Brown. 10 years later. Same arc. Different place. Again and again. Each death more violent. Each accusation more convincing. Until this Father Brown. And suddenly, the whisper made sense. It wasn't a sound. It was a passing. A name. A role. A curse. Or worse, a vessel. Something old. Something eternal. Something that chose a face every 10 years. And always whispered its way forward. So the question was no longer who whispered Father Brown's name. It was what did the whisper mean? And how long had he truly been himself? The cliffhanger came not in speech, but in sound. The bell tower rang at 3:33 a.m. Everyone heard it, but the church had no bell. It had been removed for restoration 5 years ago. When villagers arrived to investigate, the doors were locked. But the sound continued. Low, rhythmic, a bell tolling not in air, but in memory. And when Sid finally broke the doors open with a crowbar, the chapel was empty, except for the altar, where a single scrap of paper rested, written in Father Brown's handwriting, but not in his ink. The words were blood red. I am the last Brown. Let me be. Father Brown never spoke of the bell, or the whisper, or the names before his. But during confession, the following Sunday, a young woman trembling with fear whispered through the screen, I heard your name last night. In my dream, it told me I was next. Father Brown didn't reply. He simply closed the screen, stood slowly, and walked into the chapel's darkest corner, where the light never touched. And there, barely audible, was the whisper again. His name, over and over, until it wasn't a name anymore, but a sentence, and the beginning of something else. Chapter 9, Confession Tape That Changed Everything. The man who confessed to the murder had already been executed for it, 3 days before the tape was recorded. The cassette arrived in a brown envelope with no return address and no postage stamp, slipped beneath the chapel door sometime between midnight and dawn. Father Brown found it lying on the welcome mat, half soaked from the morning dew, marked with one word scrawled in pencil across the label. Confession. He stared at it for a long moment before picking it up, heart already pounding with something darker than suspicion. Recognition. The handwriting was familiar, unmistakably so. It was his own, but he hadn't written it. The tape was old, the magnetic strip visible through the plastic, humming faintly as if it had absorbed something it wasn't built to carry. He placed it in the dusty cassette deck in the vestry, an artifact from the parish archives that hadn't been touched in over a decade, and pressed. Play. The voice that came through was unmistakable, calm, gravel-edged, deeply regretful. I killed Howard Elcott. And I killed the others too. You already know that part, but you don't know why. The voice belonged to Arthur Lee, formerly a groundskeeper, briefly a suspect, ultimately convicted of Elcott's murder. His trial had been rushed, his evidence circumstantial but convenient, and his execution. 3 days ago, a closed case, a signed confession, a sealed grave. But now, here he was, speaking from beyond the dead. Father Brown sat frozen. The voice continued. I didn't want to do it, Father. But he said it was the only way, that you'd understand. The tape clicked, then word. Silence. A faint sound, like someone exhaling into the recorder, a breath wrapped in fear. Then the voice again, softer. You weren't supposed to be framed. Not like this. He said you were part of the plan. He said you were chosen. That's the word he used, chosen. The player whined. Then another voice entered, distorted, nearly a whisper, layered beneath Arthur's voice like a shadow. It repeated the word, chosen, chosen, chosen. Father Brown stopped the tape. He stood in silence, listening to the emptiness of the chapel, now suddenly too loud. The wooden beams above groaned. The stained glass windows creaked, as if reacting. He pressed play again. Arthur spoke once more. He made me record this. Said if I told the truth too soon, I'd burn. If I waited until after, it might save someone. But I don't think that's true, Father. I think it's just begun. The tape clicked again, then silence, then a final voice. Not Arthur's, not the whisper from before. Something else. Something wrong. A woman's voice, singing. A lullaby. A language unknown. Then the tape ended. Father Brown rewound it, played it again. The words were the same, but the voice had changed. This time, it sounded like his own voice at the end, humming the melody. But he didn't remember recording it, didn't know the song, didn't speak the language. Sid Carter arrived not long after. He listened to the tape and said nothing. His face was pale. His hands trembled. When it ended, he only said, Arthur Lee was cremated. His ashes were scattered. But I saw his eyes. He was terrified. Father Brown didn't reply, because now everything made even less sense. Arthur had confessed. The case was closed. The public had accepted it. But this tape unraveled the entire fabric. So why send it, unless someone wanted it to be heard now, at the point of no return, when doubt would be most dangerous, when truth would do the most harm? Father Brown returned to the archives, pulled every file on Arthur Lee, his trial, his letters, his background. Everything had been tidy, too tidy. No legal complications, no appeals, no family came forward, no final visitors. But he found one thing, a single scribbled entry on the visitor log at the prison, written 2 days before Arthur's execution. Illegible name, just initials, F.B. He hadn't visited, but someone had used his name. Sid ran the signature through handwriting analysis. The result? 98% match to Father Brown. Impossible. Unless someone was forging his hand, or worse, mirroring it. The darkness deepened. The whispering returned. Not in the chapel, in the tape recorder itself. Late that night, Father Brown heard it play, without touch. The tape didn't move. The wheels didn't spin. But the sound returned. Just the whisper. Chosen. He opened the player. Nothing inside. He unplugged it. The whisper continued. Now he feared the machine. Not because of what it played, but what it remembered. He began questioning the people around him. Who gave the order for Arthur's execution? Who handled the body? Who authorized the trial? Timeline. Names repeated. A single judge, a single prosecutor, and behind both, a single bishop. Again, the same bishop who had been hovering like smoke around every twist of the case. The same man who denied involvement while pulling every invisible thread. And yet no one could prove anything. The first big reveal came when Father Brown discovered an old confession, one Arthur had made years before, a forgotten scrap buried beneath the vestry floorboards. Water-damaged, nearly unreadable, but the final line was intact. I am not who you think I am. I was never Arthur Lee. I was given this name by the one who chose you. That word again, chosen. Father Brown now saw what was happening. This wasn't about guilt or innocence. This was a script, and he was trapped inside it. The people were real. The deaths were real. But the narrative, that was engineered. Someone had been building this story for years, decades, placing names, forging identities, editing memory itself. And now the confession tape was the match that lit the whole structure. Sid vanished 2 days later. No signs of struggle, no notes. But his desk drawer had one thing, the tape recorder, still warm, still playing. But now, the voice on the tape wasn't Arthur. It was Sid, crying, saying, I didn't mean to. He made me choose. Father Brown never played the tape again. Instead, he buried it beneath the church altar, sealed in concrete, wrapped in scripture. But even then, the words haunted him. He would hear the whisper when he walked the halls, in mirrors, in bells, in children's laughter that fell too cold. The tape had changed everything. Not just the case, not just the trial, it had changed reality. Because now the question was no longer who killed Howard Elcott. The question was who built this world around Father Brown's guilt. And more terrifying, when did it begin? The case remains officially closed. No one speaks Arthur Lee's name anymore. But every now and then, at night, Father Brown hears the hum of a cassette wheel turning, even when no machines are near. And he wonders, what if the real confession hasn't been heard yet? What if it's still recording? Right now, Chapter 10. The killer, dressed like him. The woman swore she saw Father Brown walking away from the crime scene, only to find him standing behind her when she turned around. It happened just past midnight on the cobbled lane that sloped behind the chapel, a narrow passage where gas lamps flickered like dying breath. Mrs. Agnes Wilcox, a widow known for her insomnia and obsessive punctuality, had been on her nightly stroll when she saw the figure emerge from the chapel's side door. He moved, slowly, deliberately, the hem of his cassock brushing against the damp stone. His hands were clasped, his head bowed, the same rounded hat, the same stoop of the shoulders, the same soft, precise gait. She said nothing as he passed, but what chilled her wasn't the sight of him. It was the way he looked at her. Not recognition, not indifference. It was a look of pure warning. She turned, breath caught in her throat, and there was Father Brown, standing in the lane behind. Her, as if he had been there the whole time, calm, confused, and absolutely not the man she had just watched disappear into the trees. She fainted. When she awoke, Father Brown was kneeling beside her, asking gently if she was hurt. She screamed. She ran. And the next morning, she recounted everything to Inspector Mallory, who, although skeptical, couldn't deny the timing was, once again, damning. Because the very moment Mrs. Wilcox claimed to see the second Father Brown walking into the woods, Howard Elcott's brother, Desmond, had been murdered in the forest clearing outside Kembleford. Strangled. Same method, same ritual, same missing time. Mallory's patience was gone. The evidence, circumstantial, yes, but stacking like a coffin wall. One body maybe, two, unlikely, but now 3 deaths pointed to Father Brown, and the village was splintering under fear. Some defended him blindly, others whispered the word imposter, and one man, Mr. Vale, a banker and deacon, stood up during Sunday Mass and demanded the priest remove his cassock to prove he was flesh and not shadow. But Father Brown said nothing, because now he had begun to wonder, what if the killer wasn't simply dressing like him? What if the killer was him? Not physically, not in the skin and bone sense, but in essence, in spirit, in reflection. He began to remember things he hadn't lived, flashes of conversations he'd never had, rooms he'd never entered, places his feet had never touched, but which felt more familiar than his own bed. The crypt beneath the church, for example, he had never descended its stairs, and yet in dreams he walked its passageways with ease. In dreams, he led others down there. And in the latest dream, he watched himself hand someone a rope and heard himself say, "They'll think you did it. But don't worry, I'll carry the guilt." Father Brown stopped sleeping. Sid Carter tried to intervene, convinced this was psychological collapse. But then Sid saw it too. Late one evening, as fog rolled in from the east, Sid was walking toward the chapel when he saw someone through the stained glass. A silhouette, a man in a cassock, lighting candles, kneeling at the altar. Assuming it was Father Brown, he approached the front door. It was locked. He knocked. No answer. He circled to the back, entered with his spare key. The chapel was empty, candles unlit, altar bare. But when he returned to the front, Father Brown stood on the steps, holding his rosary. "I was never inside," he said. Sid didn't reply, because he had seen the light through the glass. He had seen the shadow kneeling, and now he couldn't be sure which one was real. The first big reveal came from an unexpected source. A photograph. Lady Felicia, rifling through her late aunt's possessions, found an old black and white print tucked inside a dusty hymnal. It was a group photo, a parish choir, taken in 1935, all dressed in ceremonial robes. In the center, unmistakable in posture and dress, stood a man who looked exactly like Father Brown, identical, same face, same height, same eyes. But the photo was dated nearly 2 decades before he was born. She brought it to him. He studied it silently, then flipped it over. One name written in faded pencil. Father B. Rowan. Not Brown, Rowan. But perhaps an earlier spelling? Or a different name? Altogether, he searched the archives. Nothing. No records of a Father Rowan assigned to Kembleford. No records of ordination. Nothing official. But what he found instead was chilling. Every 10 years, just like clockwork, there had been a priest in a nearby village accused of something terrible. And every time, their name started with B, and every time, their appearance, according to descriptions, bore uncanny resemblance to him. As if the killer wasn't dressing like him. As if the killer had always looked like him. And now the question wasn't, who is he? The question was, how many has he been? Sid set up a camera inside the chapel. Hidden, motion-triggered. They let it run for 5 nights. 4 nights, nothing. But on the 5th, the footage showed a figure entering at 3:11 a.m., walking toward the altar, kneeling, lighting a candle, back turned, until he faced the camera and smiled. Same face, same collar, same eyes. But no reflection in the glass behind him. Just a shadow, not cast by him, but watching with him. They replayed the footage a dozen times. Each time, Father Brown grew quieter, until he finally whispered, "I know who he is." Sid turned. "You mean who's impersonating you?" Father Brown shook his head slowly. "No, I mean who I used to be." And then he walked out of the room. They haven't spoken of it since. The murders stopped for a while. No new victims. But the fear hasn't faded, because some villagers claim they still see him. Not Father Brown, the other one, at night, standing near the chapel steps, holding a candle, watching, waiting, and in some versions of the story, they say he smiles and disappears. Without walking away, Father Brown no longer leads the prayers aloud. He writes them now. And when asked about the murders, about the double, about the figure in the cassock, he only says one thing: "I know who did it." But the truth will never be told, and no one dares press him further. Chapter 11. Father Brown was almost hanged. They tightened the noose, pulled the lever, and Father Brown was gone before the trapdoor even opened. There were 20 witnesses that day, 20 people who saw the priest led to the gallows, hands bound, eyes calm. The conviction had been swift, the appeals denied. The whispers of doubt had long been drowned beneath the weight of perfect evidence. 3 murders, 1 confession, fingerprints, footprints, and a recording of a voice too familiar to ignore. The village was packed with press, with guards, with silence. And then the moment came. The hood dropped, the rope cinched, the lever was pulled. But when the trapdoor fell, the rope swung empty. He had vanished, not slipped, not escaped, not run. Vanished, gone. The crowd screamed. Some fell to their knees. Others fled. Mallory stood frozen. The executioner turned pale and dropped to the floor in shock. All that remained was the noose, stretched, swinging, holding nothing but air. And then, 5 minutes later, Father Brown walked calmly out of the chapel, 3 streets away. Untouched, unaware. He asked why the bells were ringing. He had no idea what had happened, because he had never been arrested, never convicted, never put on trial. The entire event hadn't taken place in his mind. It had taken place in theirs. But there were documents, photographs, the rope, the crowd, the rope burn around his neck. But he insisted, "I never left the vicarage." What began as a public scandal spiraled into something unspeakable. Some said it was mass hysteria. Others believed it was sorcery. But Inspector Mallory, who had personally signed the order of execution, had only one explanation. This wasn't a mistake. It was a message. But from who? And why? That night, Father Brown found something strange beneath the altar. A folded piece of parchment tucked under the edge of the stone. On it, written in what appeared to be his own handwriting, was a simple sentence: "This is your rehearsal. The real hanging comes next." The ink was still wet. Sid Carter found a newspaper from 20 years ago, buried in the archives of a closed-down printer. The front page showed a man, nearly identical to Father Brown, being hanged for 3 murders in a village 2 counties away. The name beneath the photo? Benedict Rowe, a defrocked priest, convicted, executed, buried in unmarked ground. But Rowe was never mentioned in church records. And the photograph's timestamp matched exactly to the date Father Brown had gone missing for 3 hours earlier that week, time he couldn't account for, time he claimed he had spent in his study, writing a sermon he couldn't find. The deeper they looked, the worse it got. There had been others. Every 15 years, a priest, a crime, a perfect case, a perfect death. And every time, the man looked the same. Not similar, identical. The noose around Father Brown's neck was real. The rope burns on his skin were real. The courtroom sketches were real. But none of it had happened. Or rather, it had happened to someone wearing his face. The first big reveal came when they examined the old parish ledger, the one kept locked in the bishop's personal archives. Sid, ever daring, broke in and took a photograph of a single page. An entry dated 1883, a Father B. Roan removed from duty after being accused of heresy and psychological manipulation of the congregation. He was described as mild-mannered, intelligent, beloved by the villagers, and completely unaware of his other self. His other self. A phrase repeated in red ink across the bottom of the page. He hangs, but always returns. Father Brown read the entry in silence, then turned to Sid and said, "I think I've been here before." Not metaphorically, literally. I remember this chapel before it was rebuilt. I remember where the floorboards creaked and which pew had the nail that tore my cassock. I remember a woman's voice telling me it wouldn't hurt this time. Sid tried to speak, but Father Brown stopped him. "There's something inside me, Sid. Something I've never confessed. Something that's been waiting." The night before, in his sleep, Father Brown had whispered a prayer that didn't exist in any scripture. Sid had recorded it, played it back. The voice on the tape. It wasn't Father Brown's. Not quite. It was older, colder, but it said his name and ended with one sentence. "Next time, don't flinch." The villagers no longer knew who to trust. Some believed Father Brown was possessed. Others believed he was being punished. Some refused to look him in the eye, because in the corners of their vision, they'd seen him already, walking the graveyard at dusk, passing the same street twice within the same second, whispering prayers to gravestones that had no names, but the worst was the letter, delivered in a red envelope, no stamp, no name. Inside was a single sheet of parchment, signed by the bishop. It read, "The rope is ready, again." Father Brown didn't run. He went to the chapel, knelt before the cross, and whispered, "I'm not afraid anymore. Just confused." And then he felt it, the burn around his neck, the tightness, as if the rope had returned, unseen. He gasped, reached up, nothing there. But the pain remained. Sid ran in, found him collapsed, hands to his throat. No marks. But Father Brown said the words anyway. "I felt it. I was there again. I heard the lever." He looked Sid in the eyes. "Someone keeps trying to end me, but I never quite hang." Sid tried to say it was trauma, memory, psychosis, but he knew it wasn't, because as he left the vicarage that night, he saw it, hanging from the chapel bell tower, a noose, swinging gently, waiting, and beneath it, a figure, in Father Brown's cassock. But not Father Brown, smiling, then gone. just like before. And the only sound left? The creak of the rope, and the whisper of wind that sounded like a warning, or a promise, that next time it would work. Chapter 12. He solved his own framing. The man who had spent months framing Father Brown left only one mistake behind, a note of congratulations written in Father Brown's own handwriting, sealed and signed, 20 years before the first murder. It arrived on a Sunday morning. The congregation was filing into the pews, whispering half prayers and half suspicions, their eyes avoiding Father Brown's as he stepped up to the pulpit. The weight of 11 unsolved horrors pressed against the chapel walls like a silent judgment. The village no longer asked whether he was guilty. They merely wondered how long he could keep walking free. He had been accused, condemned, nearly hanged, and still he returned each morning to light the candles and unlock the doors as if his world hadn't crumbled beneath him. But when he opened the Bible that day to begin the reading, he found the envelope tucked between the pages of Genesis and Revelation. It was addressed to him. No postage, no fingerprints. The parchment aged and curled, yet untouched by the damp that clung to every corner of the chapel. His name on the front, Father Ignatius Brown, was written in his exact script, unmistakable, but he had never written it. Inside, just 4 words. Well done. You're close. And beneath them, a date. March 12th, 1905, 18 years before his birth. He didn't speak. He didn't finish the sermon. He folded the paper silently and walked back into the vestry, locking the door behind him. And for the first time in this long nightmare of false identities and shifting shadows, he let the weight of the impossible settle into his hands. Because now there was only one explanation left, one too dark, too devastating to speak aloud. What if he wasn't being framed by someone else? What if he was being framed by himself? The mystery had always been layered in precision. Every piece of evidence had been surgically crafted, designed not to prove his guilt, but to create the illusion that no one else could have done it. A perfect crime, wrapped in his habits, his handwriting, his routines, his voice. Cassette tapes, false confessions, decades-old photographs, children whispering his name in dreams, a killer who wore his cassock and walked like his mirror's reflection. And yet, none of it ever quite proved the truth. Every trail dead-ended just before the final step. Every revelation birthed 2 more riddles. Until now, because the mistake, the one single thread left carelessly dangling, was the letter. And it wasn't in what it said. It was in what it remembered. Father Brown dug into the archives he'd long abandoned. Beneath the floorboards of the chapel lay a box, untouched for decades. It had belonged to the first priest who ever served in Kembleford, Father Elias Brand. Inside were old ledgers, handwritten sermons, receipts for the first church bell, and, at the very bottom, an unfinished letter written on the same kind of parchment as the one delivered to Father Brown that morning. Same handwriting, same ink, same phrase. Well done, you're close. But this one bore a different signature. E.B., not Elias Brand, but Edward Brown, a priest erased from history. Whispers spoke of his heresy, his obsession with duality, the body and the soul, the mirror and the self. It was said he disappeared one night, mid-sermon, and no one saw him again. His name scratched out of every diocesan record, but he had signed his letter, Brown. Father Brown stared at the mirror across from his desk for a long time, and then he whispered, How many times have I lived this? Because the timeline no longer made sense. He had not merely been accused, he had been prepared. Someone had orchestrated every step of this from the beginning, and that someone might be him, or something wearing him. He returned to the confessional, not to listen, to record. He placed a tape in the machine and pressed record, not expecting anything, just needing proof, needing silence. But the voice that played back was already waiting. Not his voice, not Arthur Lee's. A new voice, cold, calm, familiar, and it spoke a name he hadn't told anyone. Edward. And then, you were always going to find yourself. It only took 12 chapters. The cassette melted in the recorder. Smoke rose from the machine, but the words were seared into his mind. He checked the parish ledgers for visitors. A week before the first murder, a man had signed in under the name E. Brown. He left no address. But in the margin, someone had scrawled a strange line. He walks like the Father, but casts no shadow. Sid Carter, trembling now, brought Father Brown an old newspaper article from 1915. A priest arrested for murder. Fingerprints matched. Confession delivered. Execution ordered. The name, Father I. Brown, and the photo, identical. Same eyes, same frame, same collar, even the mole beneath the left ear. It wasn't possible. It wasn't sane. But it was real. Father Brown had been born in 1923, and yet there he was, staring from a photograph taken before his own mother had taken her first breath. And still, the village doubted. Still, they called him liar. Still, they asked him if the devil had touched his soul. He gave no answer, because the answer was worse. The killer had framed him. Yes, but not as punishment, not as revenge, as invitation, to step into the pattern fully, to become what they wanted, to erase the question of innocence, and finally embrace the truth. That perhaps, at the very start, he had done something he had long since forgotten, something buried so deep beneath robes and rituals and prayers that not even he could see it any more. And so he did the only thing left. He solved it. He solved his own framing, and in doing so, he unraveled it all. He burned the photographs. He smashed the tapes. He poured wax over the old journals. He locked the church doors at midnight, and he went to the graveyard, where the first victim, Howard Elcott, was buried. And beneath Elcott's stone, he unearthed a second stone. Flat, blank, no name, just one inscription. The Father returns. He laid down beside it, closed his eyes, and whispered, "I know who did it." And somewhere, beneath the roots of the chapel, a voice whispered back, "But the truth will never be told."